Okay, welcome back, folks. I'd like to apologize for the break in transmission and the programming tonight. We've been having some internet issues. Well, wouldn't you know? Well, I'll be asking somebody about that tomorrow. Anyway, so I've had to switch over to the backup internet connection, which is from Digicel. So let's see how that works up. With me tonight, Leader of the Opposition, Alan Chasney, is joining me from his residence in Radwe. I'd like to say a special thank you for joining me tonight. Welcome, Leader of the Opposition.
Great to be with you, Norbert.
Well, thank you very much. Well, I might as well just get straight into things because we've been a little delayed here tonight. But of course, we want to jump right into it and get straight to the meat of the action with you. There is a lot of talk about direct awards here in Saint Lucia. There have been a number that have been issued, and the opposition, as usual, of course, to those direct awards, have made a number of allegations. What have you to say about that with the assigning of loans from the World Bank and other lending institutions whilst you were in government?
First of all, Norbert, I think it's very, very important to understand the strategy of the Labour Party, and particularly Richard Fedrick. And I call it the strategy of half-truths. When we put out information deliberately, and we only say half the story, and it's to allow persons to surmise the continuation of what is being suggested. And sadly, in our society, we tend to believe more the negative than we are the positive. So what happened in the House on Tuesday last week is a very, very good example. I spoke about Richard Fedrick, in which I said, I think that he actually deserves an honorary PhD in psychology, because he clearly has mastered that art of the half-truths. So I gave a couple of examples in the House. When Richard said that the Rodney Bay roundabout was built on land owned by my father, technically he's correct. But the reality, that's not the whole story. That's only half the sentence. So the sentence really should say is the Rodney Bay roundabout is built on 400 square feet of land owned by Michael Chasney, and that Michael Chasney gave the land for free. More recently, he said that the government of St. Lucia rents office space from his facility in Colony House to the government of St. Lucia. That's also true. But we need to finish the sentence. Michael Chasney, or the government of St. Lucia, has been renting office space from Michael Chasney for the last 25 years at a rental rate of $3 a square foot. So the government of St. Lucia is not renting space from Michael Chasney because they love him or because his son was prime minister. They're renting the space from him because it's a great location at a great, great price. So this is an example of what I call half-truths. So what we saw in the House was the prime minister reading off a litany of direct awards. And again, just leaving it out there without framing what the background to those direct awards were. So when COVID hit and we lost almost 50% of the government's revenue, and the country contracted by 20%, primarily due to the loss of tourism. The question became, what sector, what economic sector other than tourism could we rely on to try to make up as much of those losses as possible? The government fast-tracked investments in the call center business, and we were able to add almost 1,500 jobs during the COVID period. ITEL, BPO, Ojo Labs, KM Squared, and when they had fallout in other countries because of COVID, St. Lucia was able to move very, very quickly and accommodate some of those companies and their business here in St. Lucia. But that in itself would not have been sufficient. We could not have moved any faster with the manufacturing sector, and we certainly could not have moved any quicker with the agricultural sector. So the only sector that we could have moved quickly with to try to make up for the shortfall in the economy was actually construction. And Minister Joseph, as the Minister of Economic Development, had meetings with the World Bank because there was a project here called DVRP. DVRP was a project that came into being after Hurricane Tomas and was specifically monies assigned towards the building of resilience, fixing up of roads, drains, slope stabilization, strengthening buildings. And what we did is we met with the World Bank because the World Bank's procurement process, meaning how they actually contract the works, would have required us to go out to a bid and making that bid available on an international basis. Unfortunately, because of COVID, many international companies would not have been able to have mobilized. So Minister Joseph very cleverly worked with the World Bank and said, look, can we break up these projects into smaller components in order to allow St. Lucian construction companies to qualify for the bidding process? And at the same time, in being able to do that, what we can do is stimulate the economy through construction. And the World Bank agreed. So part of that process was that we would have identified a company to do the design of the works and to provide the supervision, but the construction part of it, which was being paid for by the World Bank, so the supervision and the other works were being paid for by the government of St. Lucia, and the construction works were being paid for by the World Bank. We broke up the projects into smaller parts. So let me take example, Miku South. Several miles of drainage works were identified. A design firm came in and designed all of the drains, and also we're going to provide supervision. And meanwhile, we broke up the project into about 30 different components so that local construction companies, and I do mean very local and very small construction companies, could afford to apply. So at least 3 bids had to be received on each component of the construction. And that went through a tenders board. The decision to do a direct award for the design and the supervision was done in order to expedite it very, very fast. And that's exactly what was done. So many of the awards that you heard the Prime Minister speak of was exactly those kinds of contracts. So if you take the Victoria Hospital, a firm was identified to design the work and provide the supervision, and the construction work was tendered out, and at least 3 construction companies had to put a bid in, and one of those companies was identified. And so almost $40 million worth of works were identified. So DVRP projects, other World Bank monies were reassigned towards construction type projects, fixing up of schools, the drainage programs, road remedial road work programs, and also Victoria Hospital are examples of some of the projects that we did. And along with the other road programs that we did through a DFC, a Design, Finance, Construct purpose. So Nationwide provided financing for $50 million worth of works. Fresh Start provided $50 million worth of works. And Reno Gajada provided $50 million worth of roadworks. So when you combine that with the West Coast Road, the bridge that's taking place at Cul-de-Sac, and all of these different roadworks, was to really help stimulate the economy, to substitute in part what we lost from a tourism perspective. And the rationale is that after we would have finished all of that construction, hopefully the world would have been on a recovery path. And St. Lucia actually would be ahead of the game because we would have actually been building resilience and expanding the capacity of our countries. You know, there's a very famous slogan that was used by the opposition or now government or the Labour Party, in which they said that people don't eat roads. And I was out recently, and a person said to me, you know, Prime Minister, we don't eat roads, roads help us eat. And I thought that was very, very clever on the gentleman's part, because that's exactly what happens. By fixing up the roads, communities who were not getting business, people coming to bars, people coming to restaurants, and just basic business activity, because the roads were so bad, people never came. And now that the roads are fixed, they're finding out that the roads are actually helping them to eat because it's creating new economic.
But let me just cut in here just a little bit. What was the advice from those international lending institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, and others during COVID when you were in government with regard to stimulating the economy? And what facilities, how did they make those loans available to your government? What sorts of concessions or time frames were on that to make it easier so that the government could operate during COVID times?
So the relationship between myself and the World Bank and the IMF actually goes back to when we first came into office. And we had made the recommendation to lower the VAT rate to 12.5%, to put a gas tax on of $1.50, and to increase the airport tax. And I can say to you, both the World Bank and the IMF were not supportive of those policy positions. And we spent many of an hour having the discussion. So ultimately what I agreed to do was to put on those new taxes, but not to spend the money. Because they indicated that by reducing the VAT to 12.5%, we would have lost $50 million of revenue. They felt that by putting the airport tax on, that we would see a reduction in the number of tourism arrivals, and that the gas tax would have been inflationary. So I didn't spend the money, and I waited. After about 10 months, we saw that the VAT revenue only went down by 15%. We saw that tourism arrivals had increased by 11%, and that there was no inflation. And the reason why there was no inflation is because the increase in the gas price was offset by the reduction in the VAT rate. And within 18 months, we actually were making more money from the VAT rate being at 12.5% than when we were making it at 15%. And so I think that the World Bank and the IMF in particular started having a different perspective, particularly my knowledge of tourism. And I say it unabashedly. So when COVID came, St. Lucia was at the forefront of new policies. We met with the Banking Association here in St. Lucia in anticipation of tourism being shut down, the impact of people being sent home, and then people being very concerned about paying their home mortgage, paying their car mortgage, or paying their basic loans. And we were finally able to convince both the local banks and also the ECCB that there should be an overall moratorium, meaning that you didn't deal with people on an individual basis, but you had a moratorium for everyone in order to be able to reduce people's fear of what was going to happen. Also outlined to them that even though immediately there would have been a shutting of the tourism, that because of our all-inclusive products, that we felt that we could create a bubble and reopen some of our hotels. And so to immediately get the tourism back on the run, and that the momentum would carry us through, that when the market finally reopened, that we would have had momentum. So what's a very good indicator of the success of our policy? In 2021, St. Lucia generated twice as many tourism arrivals, than Barbados did. And that's pretty amazing, considering the size of Barbados's tourism product. So it tells you the success of what we were able to achieve. Now, that certainly didn't mean that we had recovered to our 2019 numbers, but we were showing promise, and that many people were able to get back into work. People were able to start supplying the hotels again, not fully, but certainly partially. And we were on the road to recovery. So the World Bank and the IMF had a great amount of confidence in my knowledge in particular of tourism and what we were anticipating in the strategies that we were importing or using. So they understood that the only industry and the only sector that we could have stimulated on a short-term basis would have been construction, and they bought into that. They lent us $100 million US between CDB, World Bank, and IMF. And they did lend some other countries as well, so St. Lucia was not the only one that they did that, under very favorable terms. So the money was for 40 years with a 10-year moratorium, means that we didn't have to start repaying the principal for 10 years, at an interest rate of 0.5%. So it's as close to free money as you possibly could get. And the idea of the 10-year moratorium meant that you would have had time to see the economy recover. So by the time you started having to repay the loan, that the economy would have recovered sufficiently that it wouldn't be a heavy burden on St. Lucia. But the reality is that we lost. So before the elections, before COVID, we were generating about $110 million of revenue a month. And in April of 2020, that number dropped, Norbert, to 45 million. But it averaged probably around $55-60 million for that budgetary year. So I'm not hearing you, Norbert.
How does the government maneuver around making up for those shortfalls in revenue? Because undoubtedly, and especially with the COVID numbers that we have now and the restrictions on travel and all of the concerns, how does a government work around doing that? And how do you compare what is being done now and what was being done when you were in office?
So remember, COVID came in, the first set of cases came in December of 2019. But really for us in the Caribbean, it was probably around January of 2020. And the new budget was coming in April of 2020. So we had no time to plan for any of this. So the drop in revenue was approximately $400 million for the year. And there was an increase in cost because of COVID. So keeping Victoria Hospital open and having to open up OKEU, the quarantine hotels, all the PPE projects that products we had, the overtimes for police, the overtimes for nurses, threw the cost up significantly. And here's one that I have a difficulty being able to explain to persons, because it's a little bit complicated, but it's a real issue. So every year, the government of St. Lucia has what's called the rollover of our bond. So a bond is a financial instrument in which the government basically says, you give me $100 as an example, and I will pay you back that $100 in 90 days, in 6 months, in a year, in 2 years, or in 5 years, and at an interest rate of 4 or 5%. Normally, when persons buy that financial instrument, purchase a bond, When the bond comes due, meaning whether it's in 90 days, whether it's in 6 months, whether it's in a year, whether it's in 3 years or 5 years, for the most part, everybody rolls over the bond. So the person keeps the bond in under the same terms or improved terms. Now, that's a non-budgeted item, meaning because consistently over time bonds rolled over, government never really put that in its budget. We all of a sudden found, because of COVID and the impact it was having on businesses and also individuals, 25% of the bondholders. So if you had $100 million of bonds out, and you would normally expect the $100 million to roll over, $25 million was being redeemed. Redeem means that they were saying, I want my money back now. And because it's an unbudgeted item, that's cash that we had to find out of our cash flow to be able to do that. So we saw in the early days about a 25% redemption in bonds. So that first year, Norbert, we had about $900 million worth of bonds that were due. And so we had to find that year $200 million in additional cash to be able to pay those persons out. So the money to pay for the cash shortfall, the money to pay for the additional cost of COVID, and the money to pay for the bonds came from three sources. The first source was the $300 million that we borrowed from the CDB, World Bank, and IMF. We also converted some loans that we had with the Taiwanese, $20 million worth of loans, and we repurposed those loans, meaning that we said, okay, instead of using those loans for something else, we're going to use it to help fund our COVID program.
But just to jump in here, with those loans, what were the terms on the granting of those loans to Saint Lucia?
So exactly what I said, the CDB loan, the World Bank loan, and the IMF loan was a 10-year moratorium. We didn't have to pay back the principal for 10 years. And we had 40 years to pay back the money, a 0.5% interest. The Taiwanese monies were 20-year loan, a 5-year moratorium at 4%, capped at 1% plus LIBOR, capped at 4%. So it was about 3.5% interest rate. So that was one source of the money that we got. The second source of funds that we got is we went to the ECCB, the central bank, and increased our overdraft facility. So the overdraft facility was increased by about $80 million for the year. We also went to the local banks and increased our overdraft facility with them by about $55 million. And then the third source of money was payables. So Government of St. Lucia normally owes people, businesses that provide goods or services to the government, approximately $30 million at any one time. And what happened is we accepted the goods and services, but we were slow in making the payments. And so the payables went to about $150 million, at one point as high as $170 million. So that's exactly how we funded the budget. And it was a temporary measure in hopes that we would have seen a recovery from COVID. The difficulty is that we did a little bit better in the first year, and we didn't have to use all of the $300 million. And we were able to carry some of that money over into the budget that's just coming to an end right now. That's why the Prime Minister said that we didn't spend all of the $300 million. It was about $20 or $25 million applied to this year's budget. So that's exactly where the funding for this fiscal deficit came from.
Let's move on beyond the finances now. We've dealt with the direct awards. We've dealt with the World Bank issue. Now, there have been many calls for the extension of the barrels concession, and of course, when you were Prime Minister, there were calls to increase the number of months from 1 and 2 months to 3, and actually went to 6 months or more. And we see only last week or the week before that the government pledged to extend the barrel concessions until the end of March, only 2 months. What's your opinion about that in light of the tremendous strains that continue on the people of St. Lucia?
That was made to the barrels, the administration of the barrels, was you had to make an appointment to be able to clear a barrel. And it's a new system, and one understands it didn't work as well as it was supposed to. Because of shipping constraints, many people's barrels came down late. And the reality is we knew that even before Christmas, that we were struggling. And I would have expected that the government, to take the anxiety away from the consumer, the public, would have extended the barrel concession even earlier. The reality is that the barrel concession works also against businesses because it competes against sales from other businesses, but we clearly understand the hardship that people are going to go through. The point that we made at Parliament was that we felt that the government understands that the barrel concessions are to be able to help with inflation. So in the last 6 months, we've seen globally a significant increase in inflation. And certainly St. Lucians have felt it. When you go to the grocery stores and you go to get other products, prices have gone up. So the barrels are to be able to help soften that. But we thought that when the government came to provide this concession, that they would have spoken a bit more broadly about the impact of inflation globally and what their plans were to be able to soften the blow for St. Lucians. But sadly, the government not doing that is further confirmation of what we've suspected all along, is that this government really doesn't have a plan. And they're just basically reacting to things as it comes. And the sad reality is that inflation is real, that there is not a lot that we can do to mitigate inflation, but we certainly have to think of things that we can do to soften the blow to thousands of St. Lucians who are already struggling, and now with the increase of cost of food, that is going to create even a greater hardship on them.
Now, talking about hardships, there have been many promises that were made to the people of St. Lucia, and I think by now we all have heard them over and over again. And the fact that this current administration under Philip JP have been unable to deliver on these significant promises that many people were depending on, and is arguable that many people voted for. And it's easy to understand that promises of bonuses and tax refunds and tax cuts would sound good to any people in these unprecedented times when thousands of people lost their jobs, when the economy was down significantly. Now the reality has come to face Philip JP and his government. What is the story really with the inability of the government to deliver on those promises?
Well, Norbert, we really describe it as the big lie. So many people are starting to realize that the allegations that they made against my government, they've not been able to provide any proof of any of those things. And more importantly, the promises that they made were false promises, and they knew that. We've seen, typical to the Labour Party, that they're attempting to create a scenario to convince people of St. Lucia that when they came into government, that things were much worse than they thought. Now, that is a categorical lie. 3 months or so before the elections, there was a budget. I can say that I was very deliberate in speaking about how dire the situation was and the cash situation was. The Philip Pierre came out with an extraordinary statement in which he said he didn't realize how important tourism was to our economy. Ernest Hilaire said that he thought that COVID would have ended before the end of the year. This is what the problem was, is that the information was there about what was happening with COVID. The information was there as to what was happening to our economy because of what had taken place globally and the impact it had on tourism. So they knew that we had a significant deficit because of the shortage in income to the government. They would have understood the increase in cost because of understood what happened to our bonds. And they would have understood that the recovery of our economy was very dependent on tourism. But yet they chose to ignore all of that information and go ahead and make promises to the people of Saint Lucia. They promised the people of Saint Lucia that they would increase the threshold of income tax from $1,800 a month to $4,000 a month. We told them that that's about $50–60 million of tax collection that they were foregoing. They promised that they were going to eliminate property taxes forever. And the fact is that that's about $20 million of potential revenue that was not being collected. So in the House sitting, they came with a proposal, in the last House sitting, came with a proposal to extend the property tax for 1 year. So if you remember, Norbert, our government promised in the Five to Stay Alive that we would provide 3 years of property tax exemption, and then we would bring in a new form, a much clearer and simpler and less a burdensome form of property tax. We ended up giving an exemption for 5 years or 4 years because of COVID. We did the 3 years, and then because of COVID, we extended the period. In the House, the Prime Minister, Philip Pierre, said that they're only agreeing to extend the exemption for 1 more year because they are reviewing property tax and also reviewing income tax. So I immediately said, well, if you're reviewing it, it means that you're going to be reneging on a promise that you made, because you categorically said that you would be giving people a permanent exemption on property tax, and that you would be providing an increased threshold of non-taxable income up to $4,000 a month from $1,800 a month. He immediately said, so no, we're going to do it. I said, well, I will sit down and I'll allow you to amend the bill so that you can just go ahead and we can pass it one time. But the reality is that now that they're in office, they're realizing that they do not have the fiscal space to be able to provide those things. And when they had a press conference, you remember, Norbert, about 3 weeks ago, I indicated that the only reason that the Prime Minister had the press conference was to now expand on the big lie. And that is to now lay the blame of the fiscal situation on the doorstep of the United Workers' Party, and to use that for the justification in order not to deliver the promises that he made. But the reality is...
Well, as you say so, Mr. Leader of the Opposition, there's a clip here that I would like to share, and maybe you could continue and comment on that. When it says Lee Kuan Yew, his last National Day address. That's the Prime Minister of Singapore. Let me just pull that up, and you give your comments after this.
And I am dead serious when I said on the eve of National Day, get our ablest and our best into politics. One key requirement is let's avoid hypocrisy and let's do this thing honestly, approximate the market rate. Try and get the government on the cheap, you end up with a cheap government, and you'll be sorry for yourselves. First job of a government is to equalize opportunities, right? Not equalize results. You equalize results, you're done for. you end up with what Deng Xiaoping calls the iron rice bowl. Nobody works, everybody does his minimum, very little rice in the bowl. What made the difference in Singapore was that a group of men in 1963, 64, 65, when we were in Malaysia, we decided that we are going to live only one life. If we have to die, we will die for a cause. That made Singapore possible. We couldn't be placated and settle for less. To settle personally for a way out for yourself was easy. You vote in jokers, cranks, weak men, charlatans, with some gift of the gab. You run a very serious risk of losing everything you have. Your future really depends on what you make of it. The government can give you that framework, can give expression to the will of a people, but the people must have their will. If you don't have it, there's nothing a government can do.
Your comments.
Well, Lee Kuan Yew is an amazing, amazing gentleman, and certainly the evidence of what he achieved in Singapore speaks volumes for his philosophy. And in essence, what he's saying is that there's no easy way out of this thing. You need to put in the work. There needs to be a national commitment to the success of our country. So it's about putting the country first. And when we start thinking that we're more individually important than our country, is when now we start to have problems. He said that if you believe in this idea that government owes you an income, that is where we go wrong. What government owes you is to create an opportunity that if you're willing to apply yourself, that you can earn an income. What the reality is Norbert, is that St. Lucia, in order to achieve its potential, needs to be able to attract in foreign direct investment. Not necessarily foreigners, but ideas and money to be able to see the expansion of our economy, because the government of St. Lucia for the last 20 years has been earning less income than what its basic expenses are. So we've spoken about them. $43 million a month in salaries, $30 million a month in debt financing, and $30 million in operating cost.
I think every St. Lucian has been able to hear that so many times during COVID that they can repeat it in their sleep now.
And so that's $100 million. And as I said to you, when we came into government in 2016, the government's revenue was $80 million. So, the famous thing where Kenny Anthony rightfully said something went wrong. What went wrong is the financial institutions said, basta. You keep promising me that you're going to resolve this deficit. It's continued to go on. You're borrowing money to finance this gap, and it cannot go on. And that's why, in 2003, the interest payments on our debt was about $45 million.
Wow.
By 2016, the interest payments on our debt was $170 million. And the money that we were borrowing was just to pay the deficit. We weren't investing the money in expanding the capacity of the country. And so this is what I said it would take me 3 years to be able to turn structurally around the country, and we proved it. So by 2019, we'd raised the revenue from $80 million to about $110 million. We were able to constrain the cost of the country, so you didn't see revenue going up and expenses going up with it. Unemployment had come down to about 16%, and the debt to GDP was below the prudential level of 60%. So the country was now poised, because we had the airport project, we had St. Jude's project, we had the West Coast Road, we had the cul-de-sac bridge, we had several private sector investments coming into the country. So the country was very well poised for a significant takeoff. Meanwhile, we were addressing very important issues: healthcare, education, security, and basically community development. Those were important because that's how I think we measure the quality of life of people in St. Lucia. But the reality is that when people now start wanting to put themselves first, and it comes at the expense of your country, it's a big, big problem. So that's what he called about the metal bowl theory, is if you have a philosophy where regardless of how much effort you put into a day's work, that everybody's going to get the same amount of money, eventually people just do the minimum effort. And there's no worry of rewarding people who are willing to work harder, people who are willing to come up with more creative ideas, people who are willing to take more risk. So there's a philosophical difference. And I'm going to say to you, Norbert, and I've said this many times, that the fundamental difference between the United Workers' Party and the Labour Party, not just since Alan Shastney, but going to Sir John's times, is that the United Workers' Party believes that if in fact the government is not earning enough money, the solution is not to increase taxes. The solution is to figure out what are the structural impediments in the economy that's causing the economy not to be able to grow. The Labour Party, on the other hand, believes that they're entitled to revenue. And so when there's a revenue shortfall, what they do is increase taxes. And generally when you increase taxes, it actually creates a constraint of growth because there isn't as much money circulating. And everybody knows that government is not the best spender of money, or the most efficient spender of money.
So
that's what Lee Kuan Yew is saying.
There has been much speculation, and some people claim to have an inside scoop. Some people claim to know what's coming up next with the budget from Philip JP and his government. One of the things that we've heard is an increase in VAT and an increase in license fees and other service fees from the government. At this point in time, what would be the effect on our economy with an increase in the VAT rate?
Well, I think anybody can answer that question. It would be a catastrophe. But the reality is, Norbert, the deficit that we had going into 2020 when COVID started, that deficit isn't as wide as it was before, because I think that government revenue is probably up to about $75 million a month. But there is still a significant gap between the money we're collecting and how much money we're spending. In order to go back to the World Bank and the IMF and CDB, so I keep saying this, the grandfather, the parent of this process, the institution that plays the most significant role is the IMF. You know, when this came about, the IMF, this is no secret, wanted us to do a structural adjustment program. And we felt as a government that it was not necessary at that time, that if in fact globally things got worse, that maybe we would have to do that. But we wanted to try our best to circumvent having to put a structural adjustment program in. And that's why we said we will create these capital projects to try to minimize the fallout in the economy from tourism. We would continue to try to expand our tourism arrivals. And if you remember the term, we said coexist with COVID. So we said the world has to coexist with COVID. The most important number to measure is really the number of people who are going into the hospital. One of the ways of guaranteeing or minimizing the people going to hospital is for more people to be vaccinated. But sadly, on a global basis, vaccines were not made available on an equitable basis. We just couldn't get the vaccines. There was a lot of hoarding that was taking place by the more developed countries, and that's what the reality was. And we made every single effort to try to get more vaccines. The vaccine hesitancy is a personal choice. But the reality is that it's going to be very expensive for the nation, because if the nation has to continuously minimize economic activity because of the number of people who are not vaccinated, to try to minimize the spread and to hopefully to actually protect people's lives, because the number of people in our country that have diabetes and hypertension is huge. I mean, at minimum, if you have a high blood pressure or that you have a high level of diabetes, you should not be hesitating to take the vaccine. So if the persons, elderly persons, people with health preconditions are vaccinated, that certainly would help the country, because it means that the country could keep the doors, the borders open, create more economic activity, because even if you were going to get sick, you wouldn't have to go to the hospital, because that's where the problem was, it's at the hospital. So this government has now backed themselves into a corner, that when they came in, they found several projects ongoing. The Shock project, housing project, the Tavern project, the Rodney Bay Road Hospital, and the airport. And let me call it what the irresponsibility of this government to go in and try to make changes is causing chaos. So you have the Shock project, in which the government put the land that was just sitting there doing nothing. A private developer came in and agreed to spend his own money. That was hiring people, there was activity on the land to create over 250 lots. And that he would have repaid himself by the sale of the lots. So it means the government had to put out no money, and it was creating economic activity. The Rodney Bay Road, you went and stopped the Rodney Bay Road. You talk about that you are a humble prime minister? Really? Your vindictiveness, your I don't even know how to describe it. Hatred, that you went and you just stopped the project? Who suffers? The same people you said you're putting first are the people who are suffering. The Rodney Bay Road should be finished. We're talking about we're in February, and the road, no work has even begun on fixing the road. And how many millions of dollars have already been spent, and people have not seen an improvement in that? When you stop the Tavern project, or you stop the Shock project, who are you affecting? Not Fresh Start. You're affecting the people you say you put first. The hundreds of people that were working on the project. The people that were potentially going to be able to buy a property. The enhancement of those overall community areas. When you stop St. Jude's, when you stop the airport project, all of these things have a fall-off impact that are affecting the same people you said that you are trying to protect. But meanwhile, Norbert, we're seeing it, everybody can see it for themselves. The economy is slowly coming to a grinding halt. And that is going to have a significant impact on the earnings of the government, and is now going to force them to get into a restructuring program. So what is a restructuring program? Restructuring program is that the government cannot meet its payments. So the IMF comes in with monies to provide support to the government to meet payrolls, to meet their debt payments, etc. But what they want you to do is to change the things that caused the problem in the first place, which is very simple. It's no different in your own household. If in fact that the income that you're earning, the salaries that you get, are less than what your payments are, so your home mortgage, your car mortgage, maybe you have a little small business, whatever, eventually the bank says you've got to cut some of those costs out in order to bring your costs down below your income level. And that's exactly what the IMF is going to ask this government to do. And whether they choose to go to the IMF or do what Sir John did and impose their own austerity program, something is going to give. And so that's why I'm saying, when I saw the press conference and I've seen the rhetoric of this government, all this government is attempting to do is to create an argument so that they can go to the people of St. Lucia and say, I told you it's the United Workers' Party that caused these problems. Well, this is we think that this is false. Before COVID, our economy was being celebrated. We were on the significant road to recovery. As I said, unemployment was down to 16%, debt to GDP was down below 60%, revenues were up, and there were several major projects that were about to take off. COVID had an impact globally. And what we were trying to do is to survive and to try to create a buffer to protect as many people as we possibly could. And make investments so that when the global economy recovers, that St. Lucia is in the best possible position to take advantage of that opportunity. This government has come in and dismantled many of those policies, I think to the demise of the country, and I think it's going to be to their own demise as well.
Now, I want to ask you a question, and that has been discussed on social media, has been discussed all over, and your take on the CCJ. Now, on a puristic level, or being a purist, simply in a perfect world, the CCJ is a good thing. Justice is always a good thing. It doesn't matter where it comes from. But with the CCJ in the region now, 20 years or so, and only 4 of all of the territories in the OACS have adopted the CCJ as its final court of justice, court of appeals. The Court of Appeals is headquartered in Trinidad, yet Trinidad has not subscribed, has not joined on. Why is there hesitancy to the peoples, even when there is a referendum, even when the government, as in the case of Grenada, had an overwhelming majority, in fact, a complete control of the House of Parliament, 15 seats? Why is it that the people in the region continue to be concerned about us moving to the CCJ as our final court of appeal?
Well, I think that everybody has their own different opinion as to why they would support the CCJ or not support the CCJ. But I think that the point that you make, that only 4 countries in 16, 20 years have joined, is an indictment. But the reality is that the CCJ really came into effect for the CSME, for the common trade market. So all the CARICOM countries have agreed that when we have a trade dispute, that the final court of appeal would be the CCJ. So this partial integration of the CCJ may be a way for reason to join the CCJ or a good reason not to join the CCJ. Then go through. So I would like to my personal comments at this point on the CCJ and continue to advocate to this government who claim that they put people first, who claim that they trust the people, then to show that that is actually what you do and give everyone the opportunity to vote on this issue. I feel very strongly about that. Now, if the government decides not to do that and to use its 2/3 majority, my opinion, or the opinion of the United Workers' Party, matters not, because they have a 2/3 majority in the House. But certainly if they do give an opportunity for the referendum to take place, and then at that point, both myself and the United Workers' Party will articulate our opinion on the CCJ. But again, Norbert, I think it's an important issue. It's an important milestone in the history of St. Lucia. And I think that the people should be given the opportunity to vote, because if they win the vote overwhelmingly, then we all have participated in that decision process. And I just strongly believe that that's what should happen.
And I think we've come to the point where we should be wrapping things up a bit. Any final statements you want to make about the failure of the Prime Minister? In fact, first of all, the failure of the Speaker of the House to say anything about that. And that was a curse word that all could hear. Subsequent to that, a number of days have passed since then. It's almost a week now, 5 days. And the Prime Minister himself, who was in the House at that time, has made no statement as to whether he supports what was said, whether he does not agree with it, whether his government will not support such statements. Not one of the 15 on the government side had anything to say about it. And of course, nobody was challenged, not that I heard, by the press in St. Lucia. One social commentator has even now referred to the House as the Maison Salopuy. What do you have to say about what transpired there?
It sadly speaks to a hypocrisy, a duplicity that's taking place in our country. But until civil society or the general public demands more, then nothing is going to change. So to be honest with you, Norbert, my focus in the House was really the financial management bill that was coming in and what the government was attempting to do. So as you know, the bill was sent to the parliamentarians on Friday afternoon. I spent the weekend researching what was going on. The United Workers' Party put out a press statement indicating that we felt that this was a bill going in the wrong direction and that it was actually watering down laws to help strengthen our financial results. And I have to tell you, gladdened after the fact, but shocked at the same time that when we got to the House on Tuesday, that the bill that was sent to us on Friday was already amended. And several of the amendments that were being proposed were taken out, and we only ended up discussing one issue. When I got to the House, I was not informed that the bill had been amended. In fact, as I was speaking, the Speaker alerted me to the fact that I didn't seem to be speaking of the same bill because I was making reference to some of the other amendments that were in the original bill. And I again told the Speaker afterwards, after I looked around my area, that the amendment was nowhere to be found. And so I try to focus, and Bradley and I try to focus on what matters the most. And as indicated, with 15-2 in the House, or some people would say 17-2, because sometimes you wonder whether the Speaker himself is being fair, and then you have unprecedentedly a attorney general, a public attorney general, sitting in the House. That you have to have realistic expectations, and that's why I've said to the public of St. Lucia that we certainly will make every attempt to address issues that we think are a danger to the country, are putting the country and overly exposing the country. And if in fact that the government does not listen to us or take or heed our input in the parliament, that we will now go to the people's parliament. And I think that that's going to become very, very important for all of us to keep in mind. Because the majority that the government has in the House of 15-2 is certainly not reflective of the majority of the popular vote that they got. The Labour Party only obtained 51% of the popular vote, and only 51% of the people actually voted that could have voted. So that's a very slim margin that they won by. We will remain focused as to what we think matters the most for the country and for the vulnerable people in our society, and the people who are not in a position to help themselves, to make sure that we continue to follow the rule of law, that we continue to practice democracy, and that we make sure that the government is not using its offices to victimize people. And we've seen some of that already taking place, and we'll continue to point those out on a regular basis. So the behavior of the House is really for other people to provide commentary on. I can say to you that it matters not to me what they say about me, or the allegations that they continue to throw upon me and to Bradley and to United Workers' Party. That's not what really matters. What matters is what the final decisions that are being made with the bills, and to make sure that we continue to allow our voices to be heard in a very constructive way.
Okay, final question for you tonight. Many people want to know, how is it that you remain so calm, so cool as a cucumber under pressure in the House? In fact, you remain calm and collected while it seems that other people in Parliament are losing their hair. What do you attribute to that?
A couple of things. I've always said, Norbert, you spent some time with me, that one of my key philosophies is to focus on the things that you can change. Remember this saying I had was like, worrying is being on like a rocking chair. It keeps you busy, but it doesn't get you anywhere. So apply your energy on things that can be fundamentally changed. The other core thing is that vengeance is for the Lord, not for me. So I really don't hate anybody. I'm not resentful to anyone. I mean, I listened to the Prime Minister try to suggest somehow I've not accepted the loss. The same night, I congratulated him. That was something that I did not benefit from. Nobody from the Labour Party ever congratulated me when I won, but that doesn't make it right or wrong. I think a principal thing to do is that there was an election, the people spoke. I may have some concerns or issues as to how, but generally they apply to both sides. I congratulated him. I've accepted my role as the leader of the opposition. I show up. I try to put as much effort as I possibly can into the job and the task at hand. But I don't hate Philip here. I don't hate Ernest Hilaire. I don't hate Richard Fedrick, or I don't even hate Stephenson King. I mean, I have different opinions of them, but they don't bother me emotionally. And I remain very much focused, Norbert, on the task of helping this country move forward. What they think of me personally, and whatever they want to herald at me. And I keep on saying, I'm very proud of the fact, Norbert, that when we came into government in 2016, out of the recommendation of the Ramshaw-Hoyd report, you remember that was the investigation into Grindberg and Rochamel.
Yeah.
Sorry, not Grindberg, but Rochamel and the cost overruns. There was a recommendation that the Crown Proceedings Act be amended to eliminate the statute of limitations. So what does that mean? The Ramshaw-Hoyd report indicated that even if there was wrongdoing in some of the things with Rochamel and also with the cost overruns, the statute of limitations had expired. So we would not be able to prosecute anybody. So the first thing that my government did, the second seating in the House after being sworn in, was to have amended the Crown Proceedings Act that took away the statute of limitations. So what does that mean? It means that any illegal wrongdoing by a government official or a senior public officer no longer has statute of limitations applied. Whenever you find it, years afterwards, if the proof comes up, you can still charge those persons. And that is the comfort that myself and my party felt as to how we intended to govern this country. And I've said to the opposition, there are very serious matters that we have to deal with the viability of our country, the more vulnerable people in our society. So coming to the House and constantly hurling allegations without providing any proof really is unnecessary. Take your time, do your investigation. If there's evidence to come after anybody, come after us and take us to court and prove it in a court proceedings. But constantly throwing allegations is actually undermining the country and the reputation of the country, because you kind of suggest that the country was a rogue country and there were all these things wrong. And these are just baseless allegations until there is proof that is provided. Now, you look at the Rover Gate, there's proof. So why isn't the government taking that up? The minister's account, there's proof that $7 million was spent 6 months before the 2016 elections. And persons who were candidates were given jobs. Joachim Henry was one of them, given jobs paid for out of that fund, which was called the minister's account. You have individuals in your cabinet in which there are very strong allegations and evidence by the fact that one of them has lost his visa permanently. And the question is, why are these people in your cabinet? I mean, you're talking about good governance and transparency and accountability. Why do you have these people in your cabinet? You know, if you in fact believe that there was nothing wrong with the Rover Gate, what's the big deal of coming out and just letting the public know what was the results of the mediation that you say took place? It's a simple matter. Who gave Ernest Hilaire as High Commissioner permission to put the car in the name of the Saint Lucia High Commission? And after it was put in the name of the Saint Lucia High Commission, who gave him permission to take it out? If you know why Richard Frederick has lost his visa, what explanation are you offering to all of us as to why we should feel comforted knowing that he is in your cabinet and in your ministry? These are important things that you need to start with, instead of making all these wild allegations against other people. And again, as I said to you, we came into government before doing the first day of work. We amended the Crown Proceedings Act to allow any officer, ministers included, that did anything wrong, no longer is it time barred. Take your time.
Now, I did say that it was going to be the final question, but I have to ask this one. We have been informed that the Cabinet of Ministers, the Philip J. Pierre Cabinet of Ministers, has reversed or revoked the Queen's Chain lease for Cabot. Now, there are very serious implications for St. Lucia with that move. The fact remains that there are a number of hotels and other properties, and many of them were given Queen's Chain leases by the St. Lucia Labour Party when they were in office. And in fact, with Cabot, the very same property which was Raffles, which had gotten Queen's Chain leases from the government, lo and behold, the government that gave those Queen's Chain leases was the St. Lucia Labour Party, the very same party which is in office right now, the very same Queen's Chain leases. What message does this send to potential investors in St. Lucia, and what are the implications for St. Lucia?
So I want to be very careful how I answer this question. So first of all, I do not want to make any comment on the merits that the government have given for revoking the Queen's Chain lease. But I want to deal with a revocation of a cabinet conclusion, which is unprecedented, specifically without cause. So if a cabinet conclusion was given and it was proven that it was obtained through illicit means, somebody bribed them, grossly neglected to take in all of the information.
Or providing false
Acted
information or something.
by false information. I can understand that. But as you indicated in this particular instance, the Queen's Chain lease was something that had already existed for many, 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 many years. And what was done was the period was only 28 years left, and the period was increased to 75 years. On a project that had already received planning approval, a project that actually had already begun construction back in 2004, 2005. So it's just amazing. But I want to deal with the precedents that we're establishing by revoking a Queen's Chain lease. First of all, banks require a cabinet approval of a Queen's Chain lease in order to be able to lend money based on the value of the land. So in English, it means that it's normally understood that if you have a cabinet approval, that would not be interfered with, and therefore the bank takes that as part of the collateral in lending money for a development. If I am buying property or making an investment into that investment, and there are incentives approved by cabinet, leases that are approved by cabinet, then again, I'm comforted in knowing, and I'm secure in knowing that those are going to remain in place, even if there's a change in government. So the precedence that's been...
Because as the investor or as the business person, there is an expectation that you have this property that you can use to generate income.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that the word that you want that we should use is that a cabinet conclusion gives certainty.
Mm-hmm.
And historically, each cabinet has honored the cabinet conclusions that a previous cabinet has made. And if in fact there are amendments to a conclusion, they're normally done collaboratively. So you would sit down with the other party and say, look, I find this very egregious. I'm not comfortable with this. Would you agree to not do this? And maybe I compensate you in a different way. So we say through mutual agreement. Yeah, that's the proper way that these things should be done. But what I'm understanding, and again, I don't have the verification of this, so please, I stand to be corrected, is that the Minister of Planning came out and made these statements prior to having discussed them with the investor. And that's a really bad precedent. So it means that the government would have come out and basically said, we've revoked your cabinet conclusions, and now let's sit down and have a discussion. That's not really negotiating in good faith. But as I said, I want to really just deal with the precedence of what has happened, which is very dangerous, and I think will significantly undermine the reputation and the trust that people will have in our country. That's not only for foreign investors, because St. Lucians who are doing business and are renting crown lands to put their business on and have a lease, which is basically also given and certified by a cabinet conclusion, they can't go to the bank and borrow on the basis of that lease anymore? Can any of the banks now trust the fact that they have a cabinet conclusion? And so now they would say, well, no longer is this certifiable. We don't know with certainty whether this is going to take place. So in the absence of a cabinet conclusion, what's going to replace that? Does it mean that now everything has to go to Parliament and receive parliamentary approval in order for the banks to have confidence that this is going to stay? I mean, this is really at this particular juncture when we are so dependent on investment, private investment, because government does not have the fiscal space to develop. This is a huge blow, I think, to the way in which we conduct business in this country. And I certainly hope that the government really has thought this thing out and is not exposed themselves to any litigation, and that they could explain to everyone what they did is not against the rule of law, and that it's not going to undermine an established principle. And, sadly, Norbert, Queen's Chain has over the years been so heavily politicized. What is important, and I think the United Workers' Party makes it categorically, all beaches in St. Lucia should be public. All beaches in St. Lucia should allow St. Lucians to have access to them. And in particular, that beach facilities should be erected on beaches to make sure that people can genuinely enjoy those beaches. But at the same time, we must be cognizant of the fact that tourism is our largest industry. That we are still very much at the infancy level of where tourism is. And we're going to have to build up a trust and understanding as to how we can coexist with each other. And so I'm not so sure the government's actions that they're taking are doing anything to help in that cause. I think they're actually worsening it, and I think that they are politicizing it, and they're evoking emotions. So it's kind of like the half-truth story as to what has transpired. But I will wait for a later date and to hear more specifics from the government and also from the developer as to where this is. I'm really praying, honestly, Norbert, that better sense prevail and the two parties can sit down and rectify this to their mutual benefit, because it requires that both parties win in this situation.
Do you think that this government will reverse a reversal?
Well, they've reversed other things. And certainly if they continue to say that they're a humble government, humility is recognizing sometimes that you make a mistake. I've made mistakes, and I'm glad to say I've made a mistake and try to solve the problem. I genuinely only hope really for the viability of our country, honestly, and that's how strongly I feel about it. That when you do this is a fundamental issue that speaks to certainty, the rule of law, and the ability to be able to attract investment. And as I said, that investment can be local investment, regional investment, or international investment. But this is extremely, on the surface of it, egregious, worrisome, and will have both medium-term and long-term impacts on the reputation of the country. And because of that, it's going to significantly hamper the country's ability to attract investment, which means that the services that we want to provide in terms of improving our schools, better hospitals, better roads, better sporting facilities, and opportunities for all solutions, this single thing can undermine the government's ability to accomplish those things.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Leader of the Opposition. Thank you for joining us tonight. Folks, that was Alan Chasney, Leader of the Opposition, and former Prime Minister of St. Lucia and former Minister of Finance. Thank you very much, Mr. Chasney.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, folks, that takes us to the end of Keeping It Real tonight. I must apologize once again for the internet problems we were having earlier. We got that sorted out. Senator Farrah Polius was here, but she got dropped off because of our internet issues. We will have her back at another episode of Keeping It Real. Want to say thank you very much to all of you who stood out there with me tonight, and the frustrations of connecting, but that's sorted out now. Hopefully the next time will be much better. Thank you very much for joining me, folks, all around St. Lucia and around the world. Hope you have a pleasant evening. See you next time. Bye-bye.